So the autonomic nervous system and visceral reflexes, chapter 15. There's two main divisions of the peripheral nervous system. Remember, we have the somatic nervous system, which refers to innervation to the skin, the muscle, joints, and bones. And then we have the autonomic or visceral nervous system, which refers to the internal organs like the heart, the lungs, the liver, the stomach, etc. Somatic nervous system is voluntary. Automatic nervous system or autonomic nervous system is self-governed, meaning it's involuntary. There's three main branches to the autonomic nervous system: the sympathetic division, parasympathetic division, and one kind of subdivision is the enteric nervous system, which is a system of neurons that govern the gastrointestinal tract. And we'll talk about that later on in a few minutes here. The autonomic nervous system is so vital to our existence that in the absence of it, the body cannot maintain homeostasis and it proves fatal. Also, the reason that most people, or almost all people, cannot cheat a polygraph is because polygraphs work by measuring autonomic responses. Most autonomic responses almost all autonomic responses cannot be consciously altered or suppressed. You cannot, for example, you cannot voluntarily slow your heartbeat to half its normal rate. The autonomic nervous system maintains homeostasis by regulating and innervating smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and various glands. Comparisons of the somatic versus the autonomic nervous system. Sensory input for the somatic nervous system come from somatic touch senses and special senses such as vision, taste, hearing, smell. Sensory input for the autonomic nervous system comes mainly from interoceptors, which we'll talk about here in a moment, but these are receptors around internal organs and blood vessels. There's some sensory input also comes from the somatic senses and special senses. The somatic nervous system is under the voluntary control from the cerebral cortex, with contributions from the basal ganglia, the cerebellum, the brainstem, and the spinal cord. The autonomic nervous system is under involuntary control that's regulated by the hypothalamus, the limbic system, the brainstem, and the spinal cord, with some limited control from the cerebral cortex. The motor neurons of the somatic nervous system consist of one neuron pathways. Somatic motor neurons that extend from the spinal cord and the brain stem synapse directly with the effector target organ. In contrast with the autonomic nervous system, which is a two-neuron pathway where we have a preganglionic neuron that extends from the central nervous system and synapses with postganglionic neurons in autonomic ganglion. And then the postganglionic neuron is going to extend out to the effector or target organ. Neurotransmitters for the somatic nervous system are always release acetylcholine. In the autonomic nervous system, all preganglionic neurons are going to release acetylcholine onto postganglionic neurons. However, the sympathetic ganglions release norepinephrine. The sympathetic postganglionic neurons release norepinephrine, while the postganglionic neurons that innervate the sweat glands, sympathetic postganglionic neurons that innervate the sweat glands, release acetylcholine. However, nevertheless, all parasympathetic postganglionic neurons release acetylcholine. Chromaffin cells, which are part of the sympathetic nervous system in the adrenal medulla, also release epinephrine and norepinephrine. So, in somatic nervous system, all release acetylcholine. In the autonomic nervous system, it can be acetylcholine, epinephrine, or norepinephrine. Effectors in the somatic nervous system, skeletal muscle. Effectors in the autonomic nervous system, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. Responses always, in the somatic nervous system, always excitation, and it results in the contraction of skeletal muscle. In the autonomic nervous system, it can be either excitation or inhibition, neuronal responses. So you can get contraction or relaxation of smooth muscle, increased or decreased rate and force of contraction of cardiac muscle, and increased or decreased secretion of glands. In the autonomic nervous system, the autonomic nervous system always monitors conditions in the internal environment, such as the blood vessels, visceral organs, and some muscles, through the use of interoceptors or visceral receptors. Examples of interoceptors or visceral receptors are mechanoreceptors. Remember, these are the receptors that are activated by bumping them, nudging them, physically opening them, by pulling on them. Chemoreceptors, a ligand binds to the receptor. Photoreceptors are responding to light wavelengths. Baroreceptors responding to pressure. Thermoreceptors responding to temperature. And nociceptors responding to pain. Like all somatic reflexes. Autonomic reflexes follow the typical reflex arc. So visceral reflexes are reflexes that are facilitated by the autonomic nervous system. If you remember, we've talked about it a few times. We've talked about feedback loops. We've talked about reflex arcs and how feedback loops and reflex arcs have the same components. Visceral reflex arcs have those same components. So we start with a stimulus that activates an effector, triggers an effector, a receptor, triggers a receptor, and then we have an afferent or sensory visceral nerve fiber that enters the posterior horn of the spinal cord. We have an integration center that then sends out a signal via an efferent neuron that goes out to a visceral effector that proceeds with the response. In the case of the afferent neuron, this is a visceral sensory fiber, or visceral sensory neuron. In the case of the efferent response or efferent neuron, it's a postganglionic axon that's ultimately going to synapse with the effector and cause the response of the effector. So, visceral sensory fiber, integration center, preganglionic neuron, one of the efferent neurons. Remember, it's a two-neuron pathway when we're looking at the autonomic nervous system. So one neuron here, another neuron here. One neuron here, another neuron here. So preganglionic neuron synapses with a postganglionic neuron. That postganglionic neuron is going to lead out to an effector which will carry out the response. So sensory neurons carry nerve impulses from stimulated sensory interoreceptors in visceral organs and blood vessels of the central nervous system to the central nervous system for integration. Autonomic motor neurons carry nerve impulses from the central nervous system to the smooth muscle, cardiac muscles, or glands, the effectors. An example of a visceral reflex in action is a Biol reflex. Biol receptors are often used to sense blood pressure. And Biol receptors in the aortic arch and in the internal carotid artery. These receptors sense increased levels of blood pressure. When the blood pressure increases, the receptor sends a signal back via the visceral sensory fiber, which in this case is the glossopharyngeal nerve. Remember, that's cranial nerve number 9, that transmits a signal to the medulla oblongata. If you remember, the medulla oblongata is what contains one of the things that the medulla oblongata contains is the cardiorhythmicity center. So this is what this reflex is going to act on. That's the integrating center. In the case of the Biol reflex, is the cardiorhythmicity center in the medulla oblongata. So the glossopharyngeal nerve sends a signal back to the medulla oblongata, and then a signal is sent out via the preganglionic and postganglionic neurons of the vagus nerve that are going to transmit inhibitory signals to the cardiac pacemakers in the heart to slow down the heart rate, which ultimately is going to reduce the blood pressure. So this is all, in addition to being the components of a Biol reflex, you can see that these are the same components of a negative feedback loop. Keep in mind always that reflexes are essentially negative feedback loops, or feedback, let me say it differently. They're always examples of feedback loops. There's a response, and then there's a change. The receptor senses a change, and then there's a response. And it's automatic. So baroreceptor sense pressure changes, increased pressure, sends a signal to the medulla oblongata via the glossopharyngeal nerve, or what we want to call this visceral sensory fiber. Sends a signal back to the medulla oblongata in the cardiorhythmicity center, which then sends out a signal via the vagus nerve, which is cranial nerve number 10, which inhibits cardiac pacemaker cells, slowing the heart rate, which as a result will slow the blood pressure or reduce the blood pressure. Another thing that we have to consider when we talk about the autonomic nervous system is dual innervation. What this means is that the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions can innervate many of the same organs. And they do it, many times do it simultaneously. Different effects, whether the signals are excitatory or inhibitory, are due to the different types of neurotransmitters and different types of receptors on the effector organs. Sympathetic nervous system often speeds let me back up. For example, one nervous system will speed up an organ, while the other nervous system division will slow down the effector. An example of dual innervation is regulation of the pupillary constrictor muscles that regulate the shape of the iris. Why do we care about the shape of the iris? Because it regulates the size of the pupil, which determines how much light is received into the eye. When the pupil is constricted, there's less light received. When the pupil is dilated, there's more light received. So the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system both simultaneously innervate the pupillary constrictor muscles of the iris. The parasympathetic fibers move via the oculomotor nerve. Remember, this is cranial nerve number 3. And the preganglionic neuron synapses with the postganglionic parasympathetic fiber via the ciliary ganglion. The sympathetic nervous system innervates the pupillary constrictors via postganglionic neurons that synapse with preganglionic neurons in the superior cervical ganglion. When this parasympathetic nervous system stimulates the pupillary constrictor muscles, the constrictor muscles relax, causing relaxation of the iris, increasing its length, overall length or width, and as a result, the pupil is constricted. When the sympathetic nervous system innervates the pupillary constrictor muscles, the muscles are contracted, resulting in a dilated pupil. So parasympathetic is going to relax the muscles of the iris. Sympathetic is going to constrict the muscles of the iris. And both divisions simultaneously are innervating these muscles of the iris. The sympathetic nervous system is your fight or flight division of the autonomic nervous system. It prepares the body for intense physical activity. It's concerned with processes that expend energy. The parasympathetic nervous system is your rest and digest subdivision. It relaxes the body and inhibits or slows many high energy functions and is concerned with activities that, rather than expending energy, restore and conserve energy. The sympathetic responses are stimulated by the 4 E's: an emergency, excitement, embarrassment, and exercise. The sympathetic nervous system is kicked in by exercise and activated by exercise. The bladder relaxes. Digestive activities are inhibited. Bladder relaxes. However, once I was done running up that hill and running back down, my bladder contracted, my digestive activities were stimulated, and then I'd have to go to the bathroom. Questions. The sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system are 2 divisions of which other nervous system? The enteric nervous system, the somatic nervous system, the sensory nervous system, the central nervous system, or the autonomic nervous system. Answer would be the autonomic nervous system. Which of the following effects are mediated by the sympathetic nervous system? Bladder contraction, inhibition of adrenal glands, increased heart rate, pupil constriction, or decreased lung capacity. It would be increased heart rate. Which of the following effects are mediated by the parasympathetic nervous system? Stimulation of the digestive system, secretion of epinephrine and norepinephrine by the adrenal glands, increased blood flow to the lungs, release of glucose into the bloodstream by the liver, or bronchial dilation. It would be stimulation of the digestive system. The autonomic nervous system has components in both the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. There are control nuclei. Remember, those are clusters of cell bodies or neurosomas in the hypothalamus and other brainstem regions, part of the central nervous system, that are part of the autonomic nervous system, function in the autonomic nervous system. There are motor neurons in the spinal cord and in the peripheral ganglia, like the dorsal root ganglia, that are part of the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And there are nerve fibers that travel through the cranial and spinal nerves. Peripheral nervous system. They're all part of the autonomic nervous system. If you remember from that slide a while back about the comparison of the somatic versus the autonomic nervous system, the somatic nervous system is a one neuron pathway out. One neuron pathway. And the effectors are always skeletal muscles, and the effects are always excitatory. When the neurotransmitter is released, it's always excitatory. In contrast, in the autonomic nervous system, there's always two neurons in the pathway, a myelinated preganglionic fiber and an unmyelinated postganglionic fiber that synapse, these two, the preganglionic fiber and the postganglionic fiber, synapse in an autonomic ganglion. And the effectors are always cardiac muscle, smooth muscle glands, and the effects can either be excitatory or inhibitory. Something to also consider here in comparison, for comparison's sake of somatic versus autonomic efferent pathways. Acetylcholine is always the neurotransmitter that's released via somatic efferent neurons. The postganglionic fibers of the autonomic nervous system can release acetylcholine or norepinephrine. Or epinephrine.